Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Andrew Judd. We're going to be talking about the genre, but specifically in how a lot of people misunderstand this topic. They'll read a letter of Paul and think it's some type of ethical rule book, or they'll read a story in Genesis and think it's teaching something that's just completely not even close, or it's hard to read the story. What are the lessons that these texts of Genesis or Judges trying to tell us? Are these characters like Abraham or these judges, are they good? Are they bad? Should we be following them? Should we not? Those are the really difficult questions that are kind of hard to understand. Why it's important to be able to understand the genre of these types of things. So how are you doing today, Dr. Judd?
Thanks, Zach. It is good to be here on this very overcast, dreary Melbourne morning. Thanks so much for having me on with you today.
Awesome, my pleasure. So, could you just give us a summary of your book on the topic? What were the main things that you argued in that book?
Yep, so the book Modern Genre Theory is an introduction for biblical studies. That's what it says on the tin, and that's what I try to do. Basically, going back a step, what do we think genre is? So how does genre work? There's been some understandings or misunderstandings about how genre work throughout the years, quite rigid approaches to genre. And I was trying to bring some more modern, literary-based, linguistics-based or social studies-based approaches to genre into the biblical studies world, so we know how genres work and what they're meant to do. For instance, books can be more than one genre, which is sort of a brain explosion moment for a lot of biblical scholars, because we often debate and spend a lot of time debating about which one particular genre this text is. Actually, things can be more than one thing. Books can be more than one genre. So things like that, I was trying to bring some of that theory into the biblical studies world, and then hopefully show how it's useful by applying it to some actual case studies. One of the things that I really don't like talking about reading the Bible in the abstract. I like to actually get in and do it. So hermeneutics, or the study of reading carefully, is best done, I think, when we're actually wrestling with some text. And so that half the book roughly case studies in a bunch of different genres, from letters, as you mentioned before, to narrative, to apocalyptic literature. So that's what I'm trying to do in the book. Modern genre theory, it's an introduction. It's for biblical scholars and also for lay people, average kind of, everyday real human Christians, people who read the Bible, whoever wants to read the Bible carefully and with thought to what type of thing they're reading. Because when you start reading something, you've got to ask the question, what is this thing that I'm reading? A parking ticket is not a novel, etc. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Computer, but you can't hear me. Oh, you can hear me now. Cool. I'll have to edit that out later. All right. So my computer froze. That's okay though. So thank you for that little introduction there.
Sure.
So additionally, another fun topic that you talked in your book was the topic of Genesis, poetry or narrative, or how to understand. That's a really, really fun one. Maybe we'll get to that. But let's talk about just understanding genre. This is going to be the really nitty gritty, nerdy kind of stuff here. But this is also really important for actually understanding any type of genre, really. So, talk about genre and the meaning of the passage. Like, what is your approach? Do you have like a formal approach, or are there questions that you ask yourself when you're just trying to figure out what the genre is and what that means for how you understand the text?
Yeah, so the first thing we need to do is actually understand what genres are and what they do and how powerful they are. So I used the example in the opening of my book of the Babylon Bee, which was kind of a Christian satirical website that used to be quite funny. And they got fact-checked by Facebook. I don't even remember, this was years and years ago. But basically, they had a fake news article about CNN or something. And it was obviously parody, right? It was obvious satire. But Facebook fact-checked. They got their fact-checkers onto it. And they discovered that this satirical news article was not, in fact, true. So this is fake news. And what happened then is they got demonetized, they got their distribution kind of reduced because they were kind of spouting fake news. And it would, I mean, that whole thing would be hilarious if it wasn't kind of these guys' livelihood at stake. Because if you're running a satirical website, particularly in those years, you needed people to be able to share it. Anyway, the whole thing was a bit ridiculous. It basically trying to fact check satire is like, that's not what you do with satire. Of course, it's not true. It's satire. But that was a good example where the genre was being mismatched. You had a system built for checking the truthfulness of real news articles being applied to a satirical website. It actually says on the bottom, it's a satirical news site. So there's potentially no misunderstanding. But in this case, that's a good example where if you get the genre wrong, everything kind of goes haywire. But it also raises other questions, like what if your weird uncle shares, I don't know if you have an uncle even, Zach, but what if our hypothetical weird uncle thinks that fake satirical news article is a real news article and then shares it as if it's truth? Who decides whether something is satire or if it's real? And if enough of our uncles share that article and as if it's true, does that suddenly mean that it is fake news rather than being satire? So this kind of raises all those issues that how we read a text is determined hugely by what we think that text is. You don't read a parking ticket the same way you read a novel. You don't read a nursery rhyme the same way you read the instructions on your medicine on how to take it. So we need to understand what kind of thing this is that we're reading. That's in everyday life. But it's even more important when we look at the Bible, because in the Bible we're confronting literature which is old. These are genres which we don't necessarily know very well. And so we need to get into understanding those genres. So you asked me kind of what my approach is to genre. I have a definition, which is that genres are these relatively stable conventions that you and I use to communicate. So writers and readers use to make meaning. But the crucial point is we use different conventions in different situations. So sometimes I'm being deadly serious and sometimes I'm telling a joke. So they're conventions of joke telling or conventions of serious speaking, but we use them in different situations, which is why I can get in a huge amount of trouble with my wife. My wife is completely unable to detect sarcasm. I, however, am the most sarcastic person that's ever lived. So it's God's sense of humor that we're married to each other, right? Because the more you try to, if I'm being sarcastic or not being sarcastic, the more you try to convince someone that you're not being sarcastic, the worse it gets for you. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation with a friend, right? Like, no, honey, I really think those jeans look great on you. No, I'm not being sarcastic. I'm being dead. You see what happens, right? You get deeper and deeper into this trouble. What's going on there in these interactions is we have two different ways of talking, one serious, one sarcastic. And we need to know which game we're playing in this particular interaction in order to understand what the other person is saying. So that's why genre is different to any other convention of human language. When we're speaking English, we're always speaking English. The rules of English always apply. You can understand me even though I've got a weird Australian accent and use words in funny ways. We can still communicate because English, the rules are the same. Genre rules, though, change depending on whether I'm telling a joke or telling a serious story. And so that becomes a source of great misunderstanding and confusion. Classic example, one of our students in our research program shared with me this awful, cringe, it's amazing but awful video of John Piper giving a sermon in front of 5,000 Christian counselors. I don't know if you've seen this clip. It's worth, if you can it's very awkward. Basically, John Piper, I'm not having a go at him as a preacher, whether you love him or don't, but John Piper is giving this sermon to 5,000 Christian counselors in Nashville, and he starts in the way that every kind of, you can imagine any John Piper sermon starts. He starts deadly serious. The man's never told a joke in his life. He begins with this deadly serious, I am a sinner, right? He just opens with that. And the entire crowd of Christian counselors just start laughing at him. And he's kind of a bit confused and he goes on and then he starts talking in more detail about his particular sins, like everything from his kind of insecurities and his hidden faults, even problems in his marriage. And every time he says something, the crowd laughs more. And you watch this thinking who are these psychopathic counselors that are laughing at this guy? And what's going on is they think he's being this kind of straight guy kind of comic sketch, right? I'm a sinner. Oh, that's hilarious. He's being deadly serious. And eventually he's like, you're a very strange crowd. Like, you're laughing at this, but I'm being completely honest and vulnerable here. Now, I'll give credit to those counselors to think that if a client came into their counseling session and was sharing their inner faults and secret demons, they wouldn't respond in that kind of callous laughter, right? But what's happening here is I think they're expecting amusing sermon kind of opening, whereas John Piper has, by his own admission, he's never told a joke in a sermon in his life. It's just not part of his genre of sermon. So what you have there is like a mismatch of genre expectations. Everyone speaks the same language, but what are we doing here? Is this like a after lunch conference talk with a couple of funny jokes at the start, or is this a deadly serious, like, reformed evangelical confession of sin moment? And what game you think you're playing makes a big difference to what meaning you take away, even between people who know the language, let alone people who are in different cultures. Like, the Bible is a foreign country. You are traveling to another place where they speak another language. Their social customs are strange. Their food is strange to us. And you have to be aware that you're entering into a new culture. So these are the things which become difficult when reading the Bible, but it's also kind of why it's fun and why I really enjoy studying the Bible. Anyway, that's a lot. Just to kind of summarize, genres are relatively stable conventions that you and I, readers and writers, use to make meaning, but sometimes, not always, in some situations and not in others. And those are things to say about conventions, just quickly. Conventions like what side of the road you drive on, for instance. Like in Australia, we drive on the left. In America, you drive on the right, I think. They're just conventions, right? There's no law of the universe that says that's the right way or the correct way to drive your car. But you do have to, those conventions are real, right? Like every time I visit the States, very quickly on the first day I arrive, I recognize that there is a certain convention here. And when I almost get killed by a bus or something, I realize I need to turn my head and look the other way because you drive on the different side of the road to me. Now, that's just, they're conventions, but they're real. They're human conventions. They can change over time. And that's the other thing about genres. They're not fixed kind of facts about the universe, which is the way that traditionally people have approached genre. They think, well, this is just the box I put this text in and that's how you do it. No, genres change over time. Like what a horror film was in 1968 is different to what a horror film is in 2025. The novel wasn't invented 400 years ago or even 200 years ago. So genres change, and you can't assume that the way that we do, say, poetry in English in 2025 is the same way that ancient Israelites in the Bronze Age did poetry. They change. Now, I say relatively stable because like you can keep up, right? It's not like it's a completely impossible task to move with those changes. But you just have to be alert to the fact that genres are always evolving. They're always changing. They're human conventions, so they're not set in stone, and they're enormously powerful when it comes to interpreting things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting point. Specifically, the idea that there's almost an assumption that genres stay the same. So poetry in the biblical text is going to be the same type of thing we see in poetry in the 21st century, or narrative, where narrative is just like for many people, it's like some straightforward historical account or something like that, kind of like a history book, which not necessarily what we see in the biblical text. Not that it doesn't include history, but it's not straightforward like a journal arc or anything like that. But let's talk about Genesis 16. So this is the story of Hagar and Abraham and Abram's wife, Sarai. So could you talk about what you talked about in the book, the interesting conversation that happened around the time of the Civil War, where there was a lot of people that were using this text as proof of God approving of slavery? Could you talk about that whole conversation, just in what you talk about in your chapter?
Yeah, sure. I got into genre partly because of my studies of the interpretation of this passage over the last couple of hundred years. So one of the fun things that we do in biblical studies is study the history of interpretation or the history of reception. Mm-hmm. And it's really illuminating because you sort of see all these people who are, smart people, seem to be doing this in good faith, but just come out with wildly different readings of the text. So it's a good self-reflective exercise to go back, do a deep dive into the archives and look at how people interpret this passage. So that's kind of what I did in some research a few years ago. And it was in doing that I was like, genre is really important here. In fact, a lot of our disagreements about this text, I think, start off as disagreements about what genre it is. So I'll explain that in a second. But just to recap the story, because people might not be familiar with Genesis 16. Basically, Abram and Sarai have been promised innumerable descendants. Yeah, excellent. We've got the text there. They've got this promise since Genesis 12. That's when God makes his initial promise to Abraham, then again in the subsequent chapters. The problem is that they don't have any children. So you can't really be the father of many nations unless you have at least one kid. So you see then in the text, Abram's wife had not given birth to any children. So Sarai and Abram kind of decide to give the Lord a bit of a kind of a running start at the promise, kind of help him get a move on. And so she has this idea that Abram will impregnate her Egyptian slave Hagar in order, basically a kind of ancient surrogacy arrangement. And we know from other ancient sources that this was a kind of thing that happened, right? Like we have IVF, or we have kind of surrogacy in a medical way today, but they had it in kind of a more basic way where you sleep with my slave, that child will be your child. Now that's just kind of part of the setting, right? The Bible is maybe not necessarily suggesting that this is a good thing to do, but the text just says that's what they did. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Anyway, that does not do wonders for the kind of domestic harmony of the house, because now you've got the mistress, Sarai, who is childless, then her slave, the Egyptian slave Hagar, who has a child. And so Hagar starts to get a little bit her status has gone up through this arrangement when she has a baby, because now she has Abram's heir. And so Hagar does something, kind of treats Sarai with contempt, and Sarai responds by afflicting her in a kind of really bad kind of situation. And eventually it gets so bad that Hagar runs away, carrying, by the way, Abram's only heir with her, pregnant with this child. So that's a kind of a real barrier and a problem for this the fulfillment of the promises, and it's obviously a bad situation for Hagar. Anyway, Hagar's on the way to Egypt, which is kind of on the way back to Egypt, where she meets this angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord says, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority," verse 9. And goes on to also make these incredible promises too. So verse 10, you can see there, "I will greatly multiply your descendants," which is, that's the promise to Abraham. And here we have the same, almost identical promise to Hagar. That's interesting. And then a bit of a kind of a foreshadowing of what that child will be. So there's this kind of reassurance, and there's these promises to Hagar, but also this command to return to your mistress and submit under her authority. So Hagar does that with that kind of encouragement, goes back, has the child back with Abram and Sarai, and Abram names the child, this is crucial, names the child Ishmael, which is the name that Hagar received from the angel when she was in the desert. So it's a kind of an interesting little story. It's kind of crucial in the broader narrative of Isaac and Ishmael and that whole kind of playing out. But it's also became very relevant in the pre-Civil War period in the US, because you had, on the one hand, this is when they're kind of debating the fugitive slave law and that kind of thing. If you remember that period of history, we've got some states that are pro-slavery, particularly in the north. Sorry, the way around. Some states which are anti-slavery in the north, and some states which are pro-slavery in the south. And this question of whether you should return runaway or escaped enslaved people to their enslavers. So some people, and as I said, I did a deep dive on this. I read through kind of all these pamphlets and books and even speeches to Congress on this subject, where they go, hey, look, Abram and Sarai, these godly heroes of the faith, they had a slave. And look, when the slave ran away, their way of putting it, when the slave ran away, what did the angel say? go back to your mistress and mother. I mean, this is basically an example of the fugitive slave law in action. You should, the angel, God's authority is, you are not to obtain your freedom by running away, and you're not to help those. Okay, case closed. So that's the pro-slavery view, the apologist view. But then on the other hand, a bunch of abolitionist writers, and in fact, a bunch of also kind of formerly enslaved people, African-American kind of interpreters, also see this story as incredibly precious and important, as an example of God's care and concern for enslaved people because of the interaction that Hagar has with the angel. So is this a pro-slavery text, return to your mistress, submit under her hand, or is this actually a deeply subversive anti-slavery text about how God cares for the kind of enslaved people and the oppressed people like Hagar? Hagar, by the way, certainly seems to find the interaction with the angel significant. She says, she actually names God in this interaction, which is wild to think about because no one else gets to name God, but Hagar does. And she names it El Roi, which is God of seeing, because basically she says, God has seen me. She feels seen. There you go. So verse 13 and 14. Here I have seen the one who sees me. So it's a very contested text, and it's a very interesting text. What's going on in this disagreement? I guess stepping back from what I think, I mean, I'm not in favor of the pro-slavery reading by any means, but I'm interested in why people end up in these different situations. Is it just that they have a different Hebrew dictionary? Well, no, most of our disagreements about the Bible don't start off life as you're just reading the words wrong. Or is it because people are reading in bad faith? Is it just because people are, well, of course the Southern preachers say that. They've got an economic kind of incentive to. Well, yes and no, right? Like you've got to give people credit for both their capacity to delude themselves, right? Economic incentives can make people read the Bible in disingenuous ways. But I think also you've also got to give people credit for the fact that they're genuinely trying to read the text. Let's just assume that for a moment. Well, why do they end up in these different interpretations? And it struck me that it's because they were interpreting this as a different genre of story. One of the things that the pro-slavery people point out is that the owning of slaves is never critiqued by the narrator. Right? It doesn't say Abram and Sarai had this Egyptian slave and that was a terrible thing. It doesn't give any moral of the story when it comes to Sarai's decision to use her slave as a surrogate. It doesn't say, and that was a really dehumanizing, exploitative relationship. It doesn't say that. The narrator just tells you. So the pro-slavery people say, well, if God doesn't condemn these actions, then it must be okay. Right? These are heroes of the faith. This Bible is written for our instruction. And so whatever Abram did, you should do too. So that's, I guess you could call that the fairy tale genre, right? These are very simple. Technically, you could call it an exemplum, right? This is a story about what you should and shouldn't do. Here are the heroes, do like them. Think about kind of like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Do you have that story growing up?
We do.
All these kind of, so simple stories which have a simple moral message. And the point is, be like the good guys and don't be like the bad guys. Abram and Sarai are the good guys, so be like them. That's I guess, the fairy tale reading of Genesis. On the other hand, the anti-slavery readers are much more nuanced in the way they read it. They say, well, the Bible rarely condemns things outright. Like Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. You don't think that's a good idea, do you? No. Well, just because something happens in the narrative doesn't mean that God condones it. And people are complex. So yes, Abram is a model of faith, but he also lies about whether his wife is his sister or his wife in order to save his own skin, a couple of times. So people can be complicated. And the fact that the narrator doesn't tell you this was a bad thing doesn't make it okay. You can't do everything that you read in the narrative because the biblical narrator is much more likely to show you rather than tell you. And so there is a moral of the story, but you have to kind of read the broader scope of Scripture to understand. You have to kind of think carefully about, just like in a movie, right? You don't have a voiceover saying, and then Zach did a very terrible thing, right? That would be a terrible movie. I wouldn't want that kind of I wouldn't want that kind of voiceover telling me what to think. I prefer movies, I prefer narratives where you have to step back and think. Anyway, you've got those two readings, two different genres, I would argue. One is the fairy tale reading of Genesis. One is the more, I guess, gritty narrative where just because someone does it doesn't mean you should do it too. Which is right? Well, there's a bunch of things I could say about that. Spoilers, I think actually the anti-slavery reading is the better reading of the narrative. But it comes down to how you think. Yeah, phew. It comes down to how you think Hebrew narrative works. Is it a fairy tale or is it a show, not tell kind of sophisticated narrative style? Are the characters heroes and villains, or are the characters much more, I guess, realistic? You know, flawed, but also with strength as well. And that's kind of what it comes down to. And we can't assume that the way we think narratives work, particularly in that ethical, what the ethical point of a narrative is. We just got to kind of make sure that our assumptions about how a narrative work are examined. So the thing about this debate is when the pro and the anti-slavery people are talking to each other, they're just talking past each other because they have these assumptions, deep assumptions about genre, which are never coming to the surface to be examined. So that's how I got on the genre kind of thing. That's the kind of the moment that I was like, okay, genre is much, much, much more important. And many of our disagreements start off life as these kind of disagreements about genre. It's not often that we're just reading our Hebrew dictionaries incorrectly. Anyway, that's Hebrews. That's Genesis 16 and the story of Hagar, and why I think genre is really, really important.
Yeah. So real explicitly, why does the angel tell Hagar to go back if it wasn't because the angel or God is pro-slavery?
So if you look at the speech, that there's two explanations for it. One is because running away from your enslaver is wrong. Right? And if that's the case, then it's very strange that the angel says, return to your mistress and submit to her authority, but then goes on, and most of the speech is not actually reprimanding her. Most of the speech is actually offering her blessing, right? And a name for the child.
Yeah.
And her response then is, oh my goodness, this is incredible. This is great. Pardon me. Hagar's response is basically to name God and to feel seen. It's like, well, hang on. If it's purely about the ethics of kind of enslavement and running away, this whole speech doesn't make sense, right? There's the length of it, for one thing, is completely out of whack. On the other hand, if the command to return is so that is actually based on a kind of reassurance that she will be blessed through that, then we start to see a very different narrative. The point is not that she returns. The point is that there is blessing for her and her child, but she needs to be named. She needs to kind of, firstly, be reassured that God is with her and so therefore going to protect her and look after her, firstly. And secondly, she needs to return so that this child can actually be born and acknowledged as Abraham's child, which is because the blessing comes through this is a child of Abraham, but to be a child of Abraham, you have to be born to Abraham. He has to name the child Ishmael for the kind of the circle to be closed on that. So it's much less about whether she should have run away or not. It's more about giving her confidence to go back and claim the promise that is hers by birthright, well, is her child's by birthright because this is a child of Abraham. And of course, at this point, we don't know that there's another child coming. Right? At this point, this is the only child, this is the only heir of Abraham. So it's very, very important that this child is born and is acknowledged by Abraham and receives the promises that come through Abraham. That's what I think is going on. The returning kind of enslavement thing is just background to the story. This is not a story about enslavement. It's a story about blessing for this child and this mother.
Right. Yeah, it's just another example of just because something happens in a story doesn't mean that's what someone is saying is a good thing or a bad thing. And as you said yourself, the story doesn't really emphasize at all the aspect of it being a bad thing that she left. That doesn't really seem to be the emphasis in any way. So Let's talk about Judges 19. So you talked about in your book about it being some type of not necessarily a horror story, but if we read it as such, it really brings out some interesting elements. Could you talk about that and your overall analysis of that topic?
So Judges 19 is a horrific story. It's at the very end of Judges where things have really kind of gone pretty bad, very bad in the nation. And it's this awful story about a woman who runs away from her husband, and he pursues her and goes and kind of speaks to her and convinces her to come back. So everything looks like it's going kind of well. But on the way back, they make this fateful decision to stop in Gibeah, which is a town in Benjamin. And there they are set upon by the men of the town who want to have sex with the husband, who's the Levite. We're not told either of their names, by the way. We can come back to why that is, if you like, in a bit. But yeah, so the house is surrounded by the men of the town who want to have sex with the Levite. He ends up sacrificing his wife, throwing his wife to the crowd who rape her. Then she is left for dead in the morning. As if that sort of wasn't horrific enough, then the Levite dismembers her body and distributes the pieces of her body around the nation as kind of a call to arms. Now, it's a horrific story. I've glossed over a lot of the details there, but you can go and read it, but just be prepared that it is possibly the darkest chapter in Judges, which is really saying something. The only thing that's darker than Judges 19 is the reception history of Judges 19 throughout the ages of Jewish and Christian reception of this story, because most commentators from the ancient world onwards have shown the woman a awful just lack of humanity. So they blame her for what happened to her. They basically see it as kind of a poetic justice that she was killed in an act of sexual violence, given that she had committed, in their view, a act of sexual unfaithfulness in leaving her husband. Now, I should stress the text does not say that. That is their interpretation, and I think it's a immoral interpretation. One commentator even asks, what was she and her husband wearing that this town reacted this way, which is one of the apparently oldest types of victim blaming that you can think of. Now, this text has had such an awful history of reception. So how can we, I guess, break out of that history of reception by reading it in a different way? Now, I should say the reason why they end up trying to find this moral to the story is kind of the same problem we had in Genesis. They see it as a fairy tale. And they're like, okay, well, what's the moral of this story? Well, the story begins when she leaves her husband. Now, whether she commits adultery or whether she runs away is debated. But regardless, she leaves her husband, and look what happens to her. Therefore, in this fairy tale reading of the Bible, where every story is kind of this moral exemplum kind of thing, well, this must be a story, boys and girls, about why you shouldn't be unfaithful to your husband, because you might end up murdered, raped, and dismembered at the end of the story. Now, even just saying that out loud sounds bizarre and like awful and ridiculous. But what are the alternatives? How else could we interpret this story in a way that doesn't suggest that the fate that this woman suffers is somehow poetic justice or even divine justice for her actions? And it got me thinking about a horror film. In a horror film, you witness terrible, terrible things, but there's no sense that there is an ordered moral universe behind it. And so it's not that like the monster is out there killing people because they deserve it, right? It's an indiscriminate terror because the whole point is that you might be next. There's no rhyme or reason to who the monster chooses as a victim. Well, in some horror films there are, but we'll leave that to one side. The point is there is this horror at the heart of society, which is unleashed at nightfall, and it leaves just this incomprehensible, this awful terror in its wake. And I started to think this is probably a better way of reading the story than the fairy tale exemplum, this is why you shouldn't leave your husband. kind of way of reading the story. So I gave it a go, reading it alongside Night of the Living Dead and Psycho, the Hitchcock and Romero films. And it works really well, right? Because there's a bunch of features of the narrative which are kind of cool to explain as a horror film kind of thing. So, for instance, the fact that the woman's never named; she's just the Levite's Pilagesh, which is kind of like a secondary wife or a concubine. So some commentators go, well, see, she's being, we're not even told her name. That's how little regard the text has for her. Whereas in a horror film, often characters are introduced to you anonymously, precisely because that could be you, right? The whole point is that they're just ordinary people who don't know that they're about to take up a starring role in Night of the Living Dead, right? You're just there visiting the cemetery, right? You're just there with your brother, visiting a gravestone, and suddenly this anonymous character, or Marion from Psycho, we hear her name, but we're introduced to her as this kind of single person amongst a sea of people in this very anonymous landscape. So that's kind of one thing. The whole kind of nightfall being when the monsters come out. So there's a whole thing about monster theory, about like what horror films do. And one of the, I think, compelling theories is that a horror film brings out the reality of our community. The behind the kind of facade, when night falls, we actually see what our neighbors are truly made of. And in this case, it's not good, right? Because they're in Gibeah, which is an Israelite town, and they're behaving abominably. They're behaving like monsters, threatening this the husband and the wife with this sexual violence. But actually, and by the way, so I think Night of the Living Dead is a great example of that, because if you remember Night of the Living Dead, when Ben is kind of holed up in the farmhouse, the zombies are like throwing themselves against the door and the windows, which is exactly how the men of the town are described in Gibeah in Judges 19. They're kind of throwing themselves against the door. So this like slow moving zombie scene, I think, works really well. Anyway, every good horror film has a jump scare where you kind of really taken aback. And the jump scare happens in this story when you got the monsters outside the house who are threatening sexual violence. But actually, the true monster is the husband who throws his wife to the mob. And that's the kind of classic, the calls are coming from inside the house moment, right? Like you think that the impure, unclean, depraved Israel is represented by this mob in Gibeah, but actually the spiritual rot is at the heart of Israel, is this Levite, this husband who should have been there to protect his wife, but actually ends up betraying her and throwing her outside in this kind of dramatic, like what the just happened? So yeah, I think it works really well as a horror film, because in a horror film, it is revealing something about society. There is an ethical kind of dimension, but you're not looking for rhyme or reason to her fate. You're not looking for you're not trying to explain away this violence, which is so often what we try to do in Bible stories. In a horror film, you're just meant to experience it and be horrified. And I think that's what the writer of Judges wants us to do, is not to look at this and go, I see that is exactly how I would expect this to end up, and that is, done and dusted, that is a kind of a narrative arc closed. No, this is deeply, deeply disturbing stuff, and it's meant to leave you horrified. Now, I know, and and everyone knows that horror films weren't invented when the Bible was written. So I'm being anachronistic, but I'm kind of doing it on purpose to suggest that maybe the way the Hebrew narrator is telling this story is more like a modern horror film than it is like a fairy tale, where there's this very tidy moral universe and everything sorts itself out in the end. So that's Judges 19. Whether you think it works or not, I think it's a fun exercise. I do it in class every year when I teach this text. And I think students find it useful and interesting to prompt reflections on different ways of reading a story like this.
Yeah, maybe it's a little off topic, but I just wanted to ask you real quick. So in this story, so the woman leaves the husband goes after her, the husband stays with the woman and the woman's father, where the woman was staying, and then the woman's father was like, hey, stay another night. And then he's like, stay another night. And another night goes by, stay another night. So what do you have any idea what the purpose, what the narrative is trying to say by including this in there, but like trying to just really drag things out?
There's a couple of angles on that. So in terms of what the intention of the father is,
Yeah.
it's ambiguous. Either he's setting up a really positive example of hospitality, which is about to be subverted when they reach Gibeah.
Yep.
Right? So like in Gibeah, no one invites them inside, which in the ancient world, there are no like Airbnbs. You can't just kind of rock up and book a hotel. So hospitality is a very important thing. And to not show hospitality like this to a fellow Israelite who's traveling is itself a ethical kind of breach. By the way, to kind of commit sexual violence against a kind of a visiting person rather than showing hospitality is even worse. So it's kind of bringing in the theme of hospitality. That's one explanation. Maybe the father is kind of playing for time because he's not sure about this guy. I mean, that's another possibility. We don't interpret it that way the first time we read the text, but by the time we've seen what the Levite's capable of, we're like, maybe she was right to leave this man, and maybe the father knows it. We're not told. These are the kind of things that, like a good film, when you go back and watch it, there's enough ambiguity in there that you can kind of reflect on things. The final thing is just in terms of the narrative dynamics, it's raising tension. Because we keep on waiting for them to go and they don't go, and then they're about to go and they don't go, until eventually when they do go, it's so late in the day that it's the most, like eventually he leaves, but he leaves at the worst possible time. When, like, what's the single most predictable threat to any traveler? Well, it's nighttime, which comes around almost once a day. And so you've got it's the most ill-advised journey that he's about to travel on. And it means that he's in a situation where he's quite desperate for shelter when nightfall comes and when the monsters come out. And so that kind of raises the tension in the narrative to a real kind of peak here, and is why they end up desperate. They can't make it home in one go, and it's why they need to stop overnight in Gibeah. So I guess it's functioning narratively as well as raising the theme of hospitality. I guess that's what I would, what I'd observe.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of things we could say about that text, but I don't want to take too much of your time. So you had a whole chapter on reading letters. That's really interesting because there are so many passages in Paul's letters that people want to say, hey, that's ethics for what we should do today. And then there's other parts where it's very clearly nobody's following it. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of rhyme or reason for why people seem to do that. Could you talk about misconceptions about how people read letters in the Bible, how they apply them today, and how we should understand as a genre?
Yeah, absolutely, Zach. So a lot of the New Testament is written in letter form. And one thing about letters is that they're written into particular occasions. We're very aware of who this letter is from and who it's to and why they're writing. And you're right, sometimes we just gloss over that, but it comes clear when we get to passages. Like I always do this when I'm teaching letters in our hermeneutics class at Ridley. I say, who here is, takes the Bible seriously, word of God, I do everything it says. Like everyone raises their hand. Okay, Paul says, bring my cloaks and the parchments. Which of you have brought your, the cloaks and the parchments to class today? Like, well, no one. I said, well, you're a bunch of backsliding kind of heathen, right? You say that you want to do everything the Bible says, but here is a command. It's written in the imperative form. Paul says, bring my cloak, bring my scrolls. So what are we doing? And it's a joke, but it's sort of illustrating a serious point, which is that we are aware when we get to that verse that we don't interpret that as being particularly relevant to me in the same way as we do other parts of the letters. I had a long conversation with a chap who was about to leave my church. I'm not a pastor there. My wife is, but I turn up on Sunday with the kids. And one of the members of the congregation was really distressed because he'd read that men should not pray with their head covered, from Paul's writings again. And he'd seen one of the worship leaders with a cap on, like a baseball cap, while leading worship, which he just thought was, well, come on, are we doing the Bible or are we not doing the Bible? What's the deal here? And the response he'd got from his friends actually was unhelpful for him, because what they said is, oh, don't worry about that. We don't have to take those, we don't have to take everything literally. And he's like, well, what kind of a hermeneutical principle is that? You don't do the bits that you don't like? Whereas there's other parts of the same letter that we base our entire, say, sexual ethics on. What are you, like, that's just inconsistent. And he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right to be dissatisfied with that answer. So what I spoke to him about is, no, we're not discounting any of the scriptures. It's not like there are verses that we do and verses we don't do. What we're doing to all the verses in these letters is understanding them in their situation as an occasional piece of literature, something written from Paul to a particular audience for a particular reason, understanding the principles that come out of that, and then applying it to our circumstances. Whereas a lot of the time I think we're liable to just jump straight from Paul says I do, which is not a bad rule of thumb, but sometimes gets you into trouble, because you have to ask, well, what is the situation? What is the cultural context to do with head coverings there? And where is the analog in our situation today? I should say, I think Paul is writing to a broader audience than just the, Paul, Silas, and Timothy or whatever. But we do just need to be aware that particularly a letter is much more tied to the circumstances of its original writing and the specifics of that situation than, say, a work of poetry, which tends to be more universal. So we do apply it, but we just apply it through a process of understanding the context, understanding the principle that's being applied, what other principles might be relevant to that situation, and then applying it to analog situations in our experience today. So in the case of the hat, what a hat means in our culture is different to what a hat means in their culture. So the principle still applies. That's why I encourage him. No, we're not ignoring this scripture. We actually should apply it, but you just need to apply it in a sensible way that takes into account our changing cultural context. Like Paul wasn't thinking of baseball caps, but what he says is relevant to how we dress in order to love other people in the gathered community. So what does dressing in a way that builds up the body of Christ look like? We can talk about that, but it's probably not to do with baseball caps. Or maybe it is. That's up to you. But that's the process you need to go through in order to apply the letter today. So another example would be where Paul says, if someone, or I think John actually says, if someone denies these core tenets of Christian belief, do not even kind of bring them into your home. Now, that might sound a bit harsh, right? Like if my plumber turns up to fix a tap at my house, and do I have to quiz them on the Nicene Creed before I'm allowed to let them pass through the door? Like, is that what is going on? Well, no. In the original kind of context, having someone in your home is a way of supporting their ministry, right? As a traveling itinerant preacher, to entertain that person, to show hospitality, again, that word, to that visiting person, is basically to support their ministry. So what he's saying is, don't support ministries of people who deny the Trinity. Oh, I can get on board with that. I think now that's less about. Heretics don't come to my door literally wanting to stay in my house anymore, but I do have to think carefully about, say, what royalties, by supporting which kind of music artists which have ministries attached to them, or where my money goes to support international ministries, who I platform in an international conference, right? Like if I organise a conference for my church here in Sydney or here in Melbourne, who am I giving money to? Who am I platforming? Do they teach sound doctrine? Do they have sound kind of ethic? Are they ethical people? Right? Do they have some kind of sex scandal that's about to blow up? Do they have a reputation for being abusive and etc.? So we need to think carefully about who we platform. Now, again, I've jumped a little bit from that passage, but it's the same principle, and it's that principle expressed in our slightly different culture where hospitality means something different. But it's still, we're taking the Bible deadly seriously, and we're applying it in a way that takes into account both our context and the original context. And that's what a letter requires you to do. Just because a letter is not Paul writing down everything he knows about a subject, it's him speaking into a particular circumstance. And we can learn a lot from that circumstance, but we just need to step back and also join those dots a little bit more. Does that kind of make sense, Zach, to you? I think I've lost your audio, brother.
Here we go again. I'm not known for paying attention to things. So, uh, in the context of letters, there is an aspect where I think people want to read the Bible as like some type of, knowledge for today. Like, how should I live today? And it seems like you're saying, yeah, we should take the principles of what the letter's saying, but sometimes Paul's letters maybe seems like it's saying, hey, you should do this or don't do this. And it seems for that it might apply for all times. It's not just like the principle behind go get my hat. It's you need to live this way. So I guess my question for you is, how do we differentiate whether it's, you know a context of we take the principle behind it, or we, like, follow it exactly as what it's saying, or exactly as what it's saying, whatever that means.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that there's scare quotes on like exactly as it's saying, because it always you have to know where you're applying something in order to know
Yeah.
how it applies. I would say that if you go through that process, there will be things that Paul says that just immediately stand out as having universal applicability.
Mm-hmm.
So if he says, you should repent and believe in the gospel, well, he's speaking into a situation which encompasses every human who's ever lived. So that's not there's not there's not a great chasm between us and them, right? We're all part of humanity. We're all kind of part of this same problem, and so that's an easy one. So yeah, I guess I would maybe frame it slightly differently, Zach. I'd say, well, sometimes the things Paul say, or John, or the other, Peter, sometimes the things they say in letters are of such broad applicability and just speak into the common human experience, or teach doctrines which are just so kind of fundamental,
Yeah.
which you just don't have to think very hard about it. You can just go, well, yes, Jesus is Lord. That is, I know what to do with that now. But even then, Paul is not laying down, normally he's not laying down everything he knows about a topic. And we know that because you can kind of read other letters where he's like, oh, by the way, this. So, for instance, you read in Corinthians, right? He says, I wrote to you previously saying not to have anything to do with these immoral people. I didn't mean don't have anything to do with like unbelievers who are immoral, because then you'd have to leave the world. Okay, so even there you have an example of what he said was true, but it wasn't everything he could say on that topic. And so even where there is theology or very broadly applicable things being laid out in a letter, you just got to be like, remember, it's not a systematic theology he's writing normally. Now, arguably, Romans is, because that's part of his, maybe it is more systematic. I won't get into that kind of debate. But a lot of the time, he's giving them exactly the prescription that they need. And you need to situate that within a broader collection of theology and other things that you might need. Just like a prescription you get from your doctor is not the same thing as a medical textbook, right? It is true and it is applicable to your situation, but you kind of need to just put it together with all the other things that you know about in order to get the full picture. So I'm not at all saying you don't have to do what Paul says. I'm just saying you need to do what Paul says with understanding the context, understand the other things in the Bible that might be relevant to that situation as well, to make sure that you don't just apply the words. Because the other thing is, you can not apply things because you're interpreting things too narrowly. So you might say, well, he says kind of, beware the metalworker Alex, who did me great harm, Alexander. I say, well, I don't know any welders called Alex, so I don't have to pay attention to that verse. Well, no, you do, because he's teaching you how to be careful of false teachers. And they might not be welders called Alex, but there will be false teachers in your experience. So this approach sometimes gives you more things to think about and more things to do, not less. So it's not just about kind of I'm not a big fan of kind of weaseling out of the Bible. I don't think that's what we're trying to do here. But we want to understand the Bible and apply the Bible, aware of the original context, aware of where that overlaps with our context, and aware of the rest of Scripture too. Because, more Bible. And look, I know this sounds like a lot of work, but it is rewarding. So it is easier to grab a single verse out of context and just do what it says. But often you're not really doing what it says, because that God has given us whole books, not just single verses. And I think there's something about that very like proof texty, let's just get a single verse up for that, which does us a disservice, when really we should be reading books, whole books of the Bible, and understanding what they say and understanding how this verse relates to that. So I encourage people to read the whole book of a thing before they try to apply any one particular passage, because sometimes context matters. Like that classic all this will be yours if you only bow down to me, that lovely kind of Christmas kind of Christian poster. Have you seen that? It's kind of a verse from the Gospels.
Really, no. I mean, I've seen the verse, yeah.
Yeah. So what's wrong with that verse as a kind of a put it on your wall with a kind of a cheesy stock art picture? It's because Satan says that to Jesus, right? Like it's out of context. There's a bunch of verses you can take out of context. That's the only point I'm trying to make there. Whereas it's much harder and much more rewarding to spend time reading whole books. We started with Hagar. I'll give you an example of where reading the whole book changes how you read that story. Okay. Hagar is an Egyptian slave. The words that are used to describe the way Sarah afflicts her, Hebrew word anah, is the same words used both in Genesis 15, one chapter earlier, and later in Exodus 1, to describe the mistreatment of the Israelites by the Egyptians who are slaves in Egypt. Now, that is not accidental. That word is used there to make you think, here is Israel, here is Abraham, Israel's forefather, treating this Egyptian in a way that later will prompt God to intervene with dramatic judgment. Now, you cannot read that as positive about slavery. I'm sorry. In the context of Genesis, it is clear what side God is on here. He is against the oppressor, and that is even if the oppressor happens to be Abram. Now, that's the kind of thing you only pick up when you read the whole book, because there's these in fact, more than the whole book. Exodus is the next book.
Right.
These kind of hyperlinks or these kind of spotlights are designed to make you see the whole, and it affects how you read the part.
Thank you. All right. Well, I really appreciate that extra explanation there. So I have one more question for you before we do that. So people can check out your book in the description. And was there anything else you wanted people to know about, whether your work or any other books that you've done or podcasts or anything like that?
No, genre is my thing. So I'm a one-trick pony.
Okay. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I would highly recommend. Really, really interesting book. A lot of different cool topics, like, as I said, Genesis, poetry. Dr. Judd goes into much more detail that we even talked about today, about just how do we understand the biblical text, apocalyptic genre, like Revelation, and all that kind of different stuff right there. So one more question for you. So you talked about Judges 19 in the context of the one individual passage. Do you have any thoughts on why that story is in the book? Because it seems to me that you could have put that anywhere in the book. If the book doesn't seem to be like in chronological order or anything like that. It could have been its own story by itself. It seems almost out of place. Why is that in the book? Do you have any opinions there?
Yeah, it won't surprise you to hear that it's partly a question of genre. So the genre of Judges as a book, it is prophecy, not history in the way that we think about it. Now, I want to reassert clearly, I think it's true, and I think these events really happened, but it's the genre of Judges. It's part of, in the Hebrew canon, the former prophets. We call it in the English Bibles the histories, which kind of gets us thinking about it in the wrong way. Because as you point out, it's not in chronological order. These stories are arranged thematically and theologically, and it's historical prophecy or maybe prophetic history. In other words, it's trying to explain this period of history from God's point of view. Now, we think, again, prophecy we often assume is predicting the future, but actually prophecy is more often than not in the Bible interpreting the past in order to understand the present and the future. So the historical prophecy or prophetic history of Judges is trying to diagnose what's wrong with this people, with this nation. And the Judges 19 episode, or Judges 19 to 21, which it gets worse, in fact, throughout 20 and 21, it shows that at the heart of the nation, in the house of a Levite, nonetheless, Levites meant to be the priests, meant to be the holy people, at the heart of the nation, there is a deep spiritual corruption, which maybe a king will fix, but maybe it won't. And so that's why the story is put here. It's diagnosing this kind of anonymous Levite who's meant to be this holy person. And I'm persuaded by, there's a scholar who points out that the treatment of women in the book of Judges is one of the barometers of the spiritual decline, or at least the spiritual rot in the nation. And so why put Judges 19 there? It's because it's the worst, to be honest. It's not in chronological order, but it is very, very bad. And it's bad at the heart of, not just at the political level, the rot is at the heart of even in a family, even in this kind of core unit of Israel's identity, a Levite's own family, and he's the monster. And so it's the darkness within. It's basically the showing that the problems the nation's confronting are problems deeply rooted in the spiritual heart, even in the homes of Israel. I think that's why it's there. And I think it's a crucial stepping point in the former prophets as a whole, showing the decline of the nation as basically, it's not that the enemies were too strong for you. It's because as humans, we are idolatrous and oppressive and depraved and taking on all the pagan Canaanite behaviors that we're meant to be standing against. I think that's what's going on.
Very fascinating. That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure. Once again, people definitely check out the book. And I've had a pleasure coming on here. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe for other content like this. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you have a good rest of your day, Dr. Judd.
Thank you for having me, Zach. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Mine as well.